All right, thanks for joining, folks. We'll get started here in just a second. Okay, thank you so much for joining us today for the release of Tariffs in Appalachia, assessing the economic impacts of new trade policies on regional industries. It's our latest report from economist and senior researcher Nick Messenger. My name is Ben Hunkler, and I am the communications manager at the Ohio River Valley Institute. If you haven't come across our work before, we are an Appalachia-based research center and think tank working to advance clean energy, shared prosperity, and more equitable civic structures in Ohio, Pennsylvania, Kentucky, and West Virginia. And those are the states that we're going to take a look at today, and how Trump's proposed suite of tariffs stand to impact consumer prices, GDP, and employment in those four states. I will pass it over to Nick in just a second to get us started. But first, I want to say that if you have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to drop those in the chat or the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Our presentation today is being recorded. We will send out a link to this recording afterwards. Um, we have also provided closed captions, and if you have any trouble accessing those, please go ahead and send me a message through the chat. And without any further ado, I will turn it over to Nick for today's presentation. Thanks.
Awesome. Thanks, Ben. So thanks everyone for joining. And I promise to try not to utilize too much of your afternoon for a macroeconomics class seminar, but this report really we felt was important. Something that was not totally on our radar, I don't think, until late in the last presidential election cycle. And then with the outcome of the election, as we kind of transitioned into the new year, thinking about what a radical shift in trade policy might mean for our region and what some of the fallout, short and long term, could look like. So at the very simplest level, what is this report about? Most folks tuning in are probably, I assume if you're on a tariffs webinar at 1 p.m. on a Thursday, you've paid attention to the headlines on tariffs. So we know that President Trump and the new administration have kind of bounced around over the last 90 days, 80 days or so on 25% tariffs on imports from Mexico and Canada, 10% on Canadian energy, 10% on Chinese imports from earlier this month, and kind of vague set of what are called reciprocal tariffs, which essentially mean we adjust our tariff to equal what another country's tariff is on us, that are kind of forthcoming. The latest date is April 2nd. So next week, these are set to go into effect on Canada and Mexico. And we saw yesterday that the President Trump announced that there would be a 25% tariff on foreign automobiles. So tariffs are definitely something that's affecting the entire economy right now. So this report really reviews how these actually function and what the impacts will be, at least in the short term, on Kentucky, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia businesses and residents. Our region in particular stands out because we have such a complex history with the evolution of trade and globalization over the last 4+ decades. You hear folks in our region talk a lot about NAFTA, which was the North American Free Trade Agreement in the 90s, the liberalization of Asian markets and growth of trade with China. We had a lot of debate in our region around the Trans-Pacific Partnership in the 20-teens that never was ratified when President Trump won the first time. So this is a really important issue for folks in our region. I'm not going to bury the lead. I will get into kind of the complexities of tariffs, but this is the overall summary of findings. And just real quick, we basically walk through the U.S. trade data. Customs at the U.S. border tracks the value of imports when things get off the cargo ship, and we know where they come from and we know what state they're going to. And so, gathering these numbers and looking at what each state imports from these three countries that are targeted by the first round of tariffs. we can kind of see that there's about $100 billion worth of goods across the Ohio River Valley from these three countries. If you split that out into the three separate tariff amounts, Canadian energy, 10% on China, 25% on other things, you end up with about 21, a little less than 25% new import tax. And it's important to remember that import taxes are paid by the US business doing the importing, right? So they unload the cargo ship, it goes through customs. To get it out of customs and to your business, to your warehouse, to our states, you have to pay the duties on it, which would now incorporate this extra $21.5 billion across our region. Roughly, that's about almost 1% of our region's GDP just from 2024. So, based on what we imported on 2024, it was about 1% of our GDP would now be diverted to paying this import tax. And across the region, that would be the equivalent to the government if they instituted a new overnight tax of $1,700 on every household in the Ohio River Valley, right? I'll talk more about what these numbers mean because it's complex. We're not saying that every household in the River Valley is going to pay that much more, but this is the quantity of new tax that the administration essentially has implemented overnight through the Customs and Border Protection receipts of these imported goods. So let's step back for just a second. Tariffs are taxes. They're levied against the importing entity, the US business that is bringing the cargo ship of goods over from somewhere else. And that means that they pay. There's no mechanism for our government to make another country's government pay a tax, right? We don't tax other governments or citizens in other country. We couldn't collect it. The IRS doesn't work there, right? So we pay the taxes on things that are being imported. The reason being, right, the idea is that if we make foreign goods more expensive compared to American goods, the theory goes, then more people will buy things made in the US. And we'll talk about that in just a second. But just a real simple example to kind of make sure this is clear is if I'm a retail business in our region and I have a $100,000 new shipment of merchandise wholesale from a Chinese factory, the shipment gets unloaded after the tariffs are in place. I now have to pay the government 10% to get those goods out of customs into my warehouse to sell. So now my $100,000 in merchandise becomes $110,000 in things I have to buy, and I now have to resell them to recoup that 110 versus 100, right? At the very simplest level. So put yourself in the shoes of a business in our region. If you're a business and you have things that you import, whether that's, raw materials like aluminum from somewhere, whether that's refined, goods from China or from Canada or Mexico, if I now have to pay this new tax to import them, I have three real choices, right? I can stop importing things. I can make fewer cars. If I'm a Kentucky auto manufacturer and I use aluminum rods that are made in Mexico, I can just simply import fewer aluminum rods and make fewer cars. My second option is I can try to buy those aluminum parts somewhere else, right? I can look to domestic companies if they exist, right? We know for things like, let's say, French wine, there's not a US trade-off, right? If someone wants to buy a bottle of French wine, that's made in France, right? There's a unique characteristic to that. And some pieces of the supply chain, a lot of semiconductors, computer chips are uniquely made in other countries, right? Or I can turn to other lower tariff nations. So maybe the tariff on China is 10%, but maybe I could get it somewhere else for 7%, which is still more than I was paying before the tariff, but at least it's not the full 10, right? And my third option is I can just pay it. I can just say, okay, fine, I'm going to pay the 10% or the 25%. I'm going to keep making my cars in Kentucky. And option one typically reduces down GDP, right? If I just stop importing and I say, forget it, I'm going to scale back my business, I'm going to probably have to bring layoffs, right? We saw some news come out of Michigan just this morning or late last night that the Dearborn Steelworks there is essentially scaling back, idling the facility to 600 employees, citing low auto demand, right? Auto demand is very tied to the tariffs. And so if you see this idling, we could see actually employment declines. Option two and three, where I either source from somewhere else that's more expensive, or I just pay the tax, the tariff when I import, I have to pass that along in most cases, right? Most economic research shows that this pass through is usually 50 to 95% of the tariff gets put into the price, right? And we know inflation has really been a rampant problem for consumers across our region. It's been, squeezing households on energy bills and grocery bills. And so now raising the price of things because essentially my inputs are more expensive, either by the tax or I have to go to other places and pay more to get them. And we know this is true, right? We have lessons from the 1980s, trade restrictions on Japanese automakers. This is a survey of peer-reviewed literature that looks at the cost in US dollars. And we know that not only do the price, in the 1980s, not only did the price of Japanese cars go up, the price of US cars went up because those industries now are protected from foreign competition. We know that in markets, when you have less competition, you can charge higher prices without getting undercut, and you can sell, to a market at a higher price. And so, not necessarily making value judgments on whether this is good or bad, but we know that the price of vehicles went up when we attempted to restrict imports of vehicles and put trade restrictions in place in the 1980s. There are a lot of valid discussions to be had around whether these higher prices mean you're transferring more income to workers, you're able to pay more folks, right? Those are really complex issues, and it's not going to be the same across every industry. So I don't want you to walk away thinking, oh, higher prices is just uniformly bad, right? The problem with our world right now really is that we don't talk about a lot of the nuances. But the baseline here is that we know prices go up when you put restrictions in place on trade. So you might be asking, well, it sounds like, Nick, you're awfully against tariffs. Why would anyone want to do these things, right? And the idea is that actually tariffs can work in some cases, right? If they're in place long enough, if they're implemented on strategic industries that we want to try to protect or revitalize, either that we have a national security concern or we want to make sure that we always have a supply of, steel for building materials in the United States, then incentivizing private investments in domestic supply chains makes sense, right? Allowing companies to not face as much international competition so that they can invest in millions of dollars in building factories here and hiring workers here. But we are talking about billions of dollars in capital. And private companies like automakers or steel companies are not going to make billions of dollars of investments to reshore jobs if they think tariffs are kind of adrift in the wind, right? If they could be postponed tomorrow, if they could be reduced or changed, or maybe they're just leverage in negotiations, that the White House is using. And so maybe 6 months from now they get eliminated. Maybe 1 month from now they get eliminated. I'm not going to invest $1 billion in a new manufacturing facility in West Virginia or Ohio if I can just wait and the tariffs will disappear in 6 months, 1 year, 4 years, right? And that's a really great point to think about. Regardless of whether President Trump changes the tariffs, will the next president keep the tariffs in place, right? Tariffs, I always talk about and make the point in the report, are really bipartisan in their support and their opposition. In 2016, we had folks like Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump agreeing on tariffs. You had folks like Marco Rubio against tariffs. And so I don't think it's a given, even if the next president in 2028 is a Republican, it may not be a given that tariffs stay in place, right? They could be unique to President Trump. And so if you're a business trying to sift through what all this means, making huge investments to bring jobs back here is really a risky proposition. Markets crave certainty and businesses want certainty. And so tariffs can really only be effective when they're implemented strategically with clear communication and strong planning with domestic businesses to bring those jobs back and make the investments. So here's a little snapshot of our current tariff rollout, right? Which I would characterize as not necessarily effective for long-term job creation and effectiveness. And I don't say that just to bash the president or to be negative, but I do think there have been mixed messages on what this implementation is supposed to be like, right? We've seen a March date, then we've seen an April date. We've seen folks say that it's going to be great for the economy right away. We've seen folks say it's going to be great for farmers, bad for farmers. It might be worth it even if they lead to a recession, right? And so there's all kinds of cross wires and different signals going on about what the tariffs will be, when they'll go into effect. So if you're a business planning in this environment, it gets a little tricky. The other reason for our region that this is particularly important is that we are really crossing a period out of a period of unprecedented globalization, right? We've seen, the evolution of technology and communication technology and computing. We've seen shipping and air travel rapidly expand, and we've seen a lot of free trade agreements and trade opening up of China and Asian trade markets. And so this graph really gives you kind of an overlay of an idea, right? Correlation is not causation, but you kind of see the picture here where the black solid line on top is US manufacturing jobs since 1985. And the color lines are all imports from various different countries, right? And you can see that over time, the manufacturing employment in the United States declines and trade imports from foreign countries, particularly China, which is the blue line, have dramatically risen. There's a couple things here, right? We typically think of NAFTA or talk about NAFTA as this large thing that destroyed US manufacturing. And we see that from the 90s, that's not a huge decline, right? Most economists say on net that the NAFTA job loss was pretty minimal. In our region, it was a little bit stronger. People have a little bit more reason to be frustrated by the NAFTA terms in our part of the country. But trade really doesn't drive US manufacturing employment as much as domestic shocks, things like recessions. We can see the largest, steepest declines in manufacturing employment came during the last two recessions. And so when you hear the administration say something like, even if there's a recession in the short term, tariffs will be beneficial, well, recessions tend to impact manufacturing employment in much more negative ways than imbalances in trade policy with any one country. So that's another component of all of this to think about. Another issue is that we typically don't lose as much from trade with countries that still buy our stuff. And Canada and Mexico actually import quite a bit of US made goods. This graph shows US exports to Canada, Mexico, and China, and we can see China has this unique status of it exports a lot of things to us, but it doesn't buy a lot of things from us. And that's where real imbalances start to manifest, right? The point I would make going back to this graph is that you see some steep decline of manufacturing in the early 2000s, not necessarily after NAFTA is signed into law, but actually after China joins the WTO and we see China kind of come to the world trading stage. And then just to really underscore this point before we get into some region-specific effects, there's almost nothing we make in the United States that doesn't cross a border in its supply chain at some point. And this graph or this graphic, which is kind of modeled on one from the BBC, really illustrates that, I thought, really excellently, which, you get aluminum out of Tennessee, you move it to turn it into rods in Pennsylvania, it gets shipped up into Canada to get shaped and polished. Those get shipped to Mexico to make pistons. The pistons get shipped back into Michigan to make engines for cars, right? So you've got two border crossings, two of both trade partners in North America are involved, and that's just the supply chain for pistons, right? And we know pistons aren't the only part of an engine, and the engine's not the only part of the car. So you start to think about how this scales and realize that you're really impacting virtually every good we buy that's manufactured when you start implementing tariffs. The other data point we kind of have to draw on is what happened last time when we implemented tariffs. These were much narrower in 2018 during President Trump's first term. But the idea here is that, the tariffs last time were much more for negotiation, for posturing. They allowed him to renegotiate NAFTA into the US-Canada-Mexico agreement, which gave us some new beneficial terms of trade. I'm not arguing that NAFTA or USCMA are brilliant, amazing, perfect trade deals, right? When we talk about trade deals, worker protections, minimum wage guarantees, environmental protections, all have to be part of those trade negotiations. And so last time President Trump used the threat of tariffs as part of this renegotiation strategy. We saw in 2018 the media often called it the trade war with China, where China actually retaliated with tariffs. A key point there is that over 90% of the revenue generated from those tariffs on Chinese goods was offset by US emergency payments to farmers. So we hear a lot of discussion now about how the new tariffs will be, tools to help us pay down the national debt or to cut income taxes for Americans. But our evidence from last time is that over 90% of the money we made on the tariffs had to be just plowed right back in to kind of help make people whole from the damage the tariffs did. And then we know last time the steel and aluminum tariffs in 2018, which President Biden kept in place in some places and cut in other places, raised steel and aluminum prices by about 5 and 10%. And that we never returned back to world levels, right? So even when the prices started to come down, they still remained above the world price for those goods in untariffed countries. So in an environment where we've had a lot of inflation, tariffs typically tend to be forces that raise prices in the economy. So let's turn to our region and talk about the Ohio River Valley and how all of this fits in. Roughly 100 billion, as I mentioned, and that's about a third of all trade. So this circle shows all of our major trading partners. You can see Canada's about 13% of our region's four-state regions trade. China's 11%, Mexico's 9%, Germany's next at 6%. But really, these are a huge chunk of this circle, right? These three countries that have been hit by this first round of tariffs. Across the three states, they actually have some different compositions. Kentucky does a lot of trade, about 3.5% of its GDP worth of imports from Mexico. Ohio does most of its trade with Canada. Pennsylvania does most of its trade just by a slim margin with China. And West Virginia is actually much less involved with trade and does most of it with Canada of what it does do. So actually, the tariffs probably impact the four states a little bit differently because different types of goods are being made in Canada, Mexico, China, and that's affecting consumers and households and businesses in the four states a little bit differently. So we'll just run through some of these impacts to give you an idea. What this represents is a percentage of 2024's GDP, what the tariff would have been by industry had it been in place, right? And so this is kind of a high end, if we didn't reduce imports at all from last year and we just kept paying the tariff, we would see that this is going to impact Kentucky's transportation equipment, computers and electronics, primary metal, aluminum and copper are big industries in Kentucky. The automotive and aerospace industries are quite large in Kentucky. And so we see that, up to a 0.3% of GDP. That doesn't sound like a lot, right? 0.3%, a third of 1%. But then you start thinking about adding all these blue bars together, right? You start thinking about, okay, well, now we're impacting businesses that have, multiple percentage points of the state's GDP are tied up in these industries that are now going to have to pay a tax, right? That they did not have to pay last year. But by far and large in Kentucky, the largest impact comes to automotive manufacturers. And so what we did is we modeled this against the GDP growth trends in the state, right? And you can see that basically these are the GDP growth. It's going to be negative in all of the states for 2020 because of COVID. But you can see that the red dotted line kind of shows what a deviated growth trend would have been for GDP in Kentucky had these tariffs been in place. And so instead of growing Kentucky's economy by 2%, you would have grown it by less than 1% last year, right? Had the businesses had this extra burden placed on them by the tax. The GDP still goes down, right? If the businesses don't pay the tax and they import less, because now they either have to produce less or scale back production or source new production, raise prices, consumers buy less, right? So these ripple feedback effects, it might not just be the tariff, but it's other market effects from the tariff, right? Reduce the overall economic activity in the state. In Ohio, we also see the oil industry added to the list alongside automotive and metal and chemicals. Ohio has quite an interesting kind of landscape with pipelines from Canada and a couple refineries in the northern part of the state. Similar story on GDP. Ohio's GDP, instead of growing by 2%, would have grown by about 1.6% last year, right? So it's a sizable chunk of the GDP growth would have been offset by the tariffs, pushing it below its kind of 10-year growth trend. Pennsylvania's composition, we see kind of automotive fade further down the list, but we see a huge impact on chemicals, on metal manufacturing, which is somewhat unsurprising with the steel industry in the state. And we also see a huge impact relative to other industries on computer and electronics products, which is particularly interesting because we know in Pennsylvania that Governor Shapiro has really been pushing the growth of the semiconductor, advanced manufacturing, computer, and electronic production industry. And so to see that kind of offset then by the effect of tariffs starts to feel a little bit of those economic kind of headwinds to growth. And a similar story, Pennsylvania's economic growth would have been about 0.5% less annually with the tariffs in place. And then finally, West Virginia, the same story, the auto and metal industries, chemical industries, machinery, paper. The interesting thing is if you look at the scale here, these are much lower percents of GDP. And there's a reason, and that is that West Virginia's economy is less tied to imports than the other three states. The GDP is lower, the imports from Canada, Mexico, and China are lower. And so in a way, West Virginia is actually somewhat insulated, right? It would actually grow less, but it's sort of close to the same trend. So, of the four states, West Virginia certainly stands to be the least impacted by the tariffs, even though it's still negatively impacted. Um, a key point I'll make here too is that we didn't attempt to try to assume anything about retaliatory tariffs, right? That's very speculative. We didn't want to make stuff up and say, well, if China implements a new retaliation tariff on farmers, right, then we're just trying to estimate made up stuff. But it is important to note that the retaliatory tariffs, if they happen, might crunch some of these states even more, right? We've seen a lot in the headlines about a potential tariff on alcohol sales from Europe. They've threatened to retaliate against Kentucky's bourbon industry, right? And to talk about putting tariffs on American bourbon and whiskey. That would certainly have a negative draw on Kentucky in a way that it might not on other states in the region. And that kind of thing, right? So the retaliatory tariffs certainly stand to add to these negative impacts from the import restrictions. So a few final notes. These are short-term adjustments, and they don't account necessarily for a rebalancing. We know people are going to change their behavior. We know businesses will import less or produce less or raise prices. Long term, you could see growth in certain industries, but the big if there is, are the tariffs going to be implemented strategically in a way that they're not right now? Are they going to be the correct magnitude? Are they going to be in certain industries that are advantageous for the US? Are they going to be clearly communicated in advance and implemented with the expectation of stability that long term they will continue to exist so you are safe to make a large capital investment in the United States and be protected by them? They will not disappear in 6 months and leave you holding the bag for that large investment in American jobs. And tariffs could adversely impact recent growth we've seen from major investments in clean energy and advanced manufacturing, right? A lot of components of various clean energy technology and products are manufactured overseas. So a lot of the investment we saw around the Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure law are going to be contingent on being able to procure goods that we thought before we would be able to import, right? Solar panels and the like. So future tariffs definitely could weigh and kind of drag down some of those clean energy and advanced manufacturing growth points we've seen in our region. And in summary, the tariffs really are an overnight tax hike as it currently stands. Businesses are going to have to cope with this $4.1 billion new charge the federal government is putting on their account. And we talked about they have a couple different options of how to absorb that $4.1 billion tax. They could pass it on to consumers and households, or they could, change their production or scale back their production in the short term. The numbers in the report, we talked about the household numbers, and I want to be really clear what those mean. We look at this as a $4.1 billion tax overnight on businesses that import to our four states. Based on their 2024 data, we know that is the import level to the four Ohio River Valley states. This would be the same amount of money as if the federal government decided overnight to raise everybody's household taxes by $1,700. Now, does that mean every household will pay $1,700 to the federal government as a result of the tariffs? No, we know not all households consume the same. Some households might need to buy a new car this year if their car dies on them, right? They're going to pay more to do that. Other households are going to choose to keep driving their car for another, year or two until the landscape changes and maybe prices come back down. So we know it's going to be distributed unequally. Most national estimates put the household impact at about $1,200. We think in our region it will be a little bit higher. So the way I would interpret the findings of this report would be The impact per household is realistically and through higher prices is likely to be somewhere between that national average of 1,200 that other studies have found that have looked at all 50 states and this high number that we kind of show that would imagine that everything made in Kentucky is consumed in Kentucky. We know that's not true. Some of the higher priced goods are going to be sold in other states, and we know Kentuckians are going to buy higher priced goods that are made in other states, and it's very difficult to kind of account all of these in the ledger. So somewhere between that $1,200 and $1,700 number on average for our region. But what that really shows is that in most of our region, households are going to get squeezed a little bit tighter by these higher prices than the national average. And then finally, this just walks back through those core conclusions that tariffs can be effective, that there may be a need to rebalance some trade, especially with some of our Asian trading partners, but that those have to really come with strategic implementation and stability. We know we have a crisis of declining manufacturing employment over the last 40 years due to automation, due to recessions, and some of it due to trade. And we know that the current proposed tariff regime going into place next week as of now is most likely to create some short-term price increases to really tax the supply chain and create some medium-term shortages potentially, and actually potentially cost U.S. jobs as firms adjust or scale back their production. In part, this is because nobody has ever tried to implement widespread, broad tariffs after the type of 40-year run of globalization we've just experienced, which is almost nothing like it in human history. And so trying to untangle that rapid integration of the global economy overnight is a really, really precarious task with a lot of unintended consequences and effects that will inevitably kind of spring up as that attempts to happen. And so I'll loop back to the summary of the findings, the core kind of numbers from this report, and be happy to take any questions. I know I ran through all of that pretty quickly. It's explained in much more detail in the report, but I appreciate everyone hanging with me.
Cool. Thanks so much, Nick. A link to the full report is in the chat, so do please check that out. And again, yeah, feel free to drop questions in the Q&A box or in the chat as well. Um, Hillary Flint, I see that you have your hand raised. If you'd like to come off mute and go ahead and ask your question, you're welcome to do so.
Sorry, Ben, that was a mistake. I don't have a question, but this was incredible as always. You guys did an amazing job on this research. This is just what we needed. So thank you.
Oh, well, thank you. I'm happy to hear that. I'm glad it was helpful.
Nick, we've got a question in the chat from Sophia who asks how these tariffs might change the landscape around oil and gas in the region.
Yeah, so that's kind of an interesting component, right? We've seen some utilities. I highlight in the report that in Ohio, we've seen First Energy actually tell shareholders in some of its financial calls that it anticipates the tariffs delaying some of its infrastructure work, right? I know First Energy is not an oil and gas company, it's a utility company, right? But they have gas-fired power plants. I think that's going to be one major way this impacts the oil and gas industry in the immediate term, is it actually so, depending on your perspective, right? I mean, slowing down infrastructure investments in new pipelines or the expansion and construction of new fossil fuel plants is definitely something that these could do. But I also would add that this probably hinders the clean energy transition as much as it does the conventional energy grid and infrastructure as well, because we know we don't necessarily manufacture all of the components of the clean energy transition here in the United States, right? And so I think that it kind of handicaps both, if that makes sense. And I think it just will depend who has the ability to pivot. If the tariffs go into place and they stay in place, whether that's an issue for the more of an issue for the clean energy transition or more of an issue for oil and gas, I think kind of remains to be seen.
Thanks for the question, Sophia.
And I will note real quick that oil and gas flag for Ohio is driven almost primarily by two Canadian oil refineries in Toledo and Lima, Ohio, in the northwest part of the state. And so if you're suddenly importing, right, energy at 10% coming across the Canadian border that feeds those refineries, they're actually owned by a Canadian company. So that's kind of why oil and gas flagged for Ohio in a way that it didn't for the other states, is that Ohio's oil and gas refineries almost immediately take their feed from Canadian imports.
Thanks, Nick. Yeah,
Great
again,
question.
welcome any other questions in the chat. Nick, I've seen a lot of reporting on how these tariffs might impact farmers in our four-state region. Could you talk a little bit about the impacts on agriculture here?
Yeah, so agriculture is an interesting one because agriculture was really actually one of the large winners from the last round of free trade negotiations, right? We think about the loss of manufacturing jobs and kind of ascribe that to NAFTA and to liberalization of trade with China and making things overseas, and the loss of American jobs. But American agriculture actually became a dominant exporter, right, under these free trade agreements, and export quite a bit to China. And one of the reasons you can trace parts of the origins of the current immigration trends, right, from Mexico to the United States actually is rooted in agriculture. Agricultural free trade really undermined Mexico's agricultural industry in a lot of ways, as American farmers are larger scale, and we're not passing any kind of moral judgment or environmental judgment on different styles of agriculture, but the facts kind of bear out that agriculture has benefited immensely from these trade agreements across the board. And so when you start restricting that, you have a couple problems. One is, when we did tariffs before, we threatened tariffs in 2018. President Trump, often actually said that the U.S. access to Canadian dairy markets was one of his driving factors. He was very unhappy with U.S. dairy farmers having very limited access to Canadian consumers, which was something Canada had kind of sheltered, right? They did not want that. So the USMCA kind of gave American farmers more access to dairy markets, and that was one of the things President Trump really claimed as a great improvement over NAFTA. If you implement the tariffs, one of the things that actually happens is if you drop demand for dairy, you now have excess supply. So you have a bunch of dairy farmers in the United States with a bunch of dairy that they can't sell to Canada anymore, and they have to sell it somewhere. Americans only consume so much dairy, right? Americans only consume so much wheat or so much soy or so much corn. You have to sell it out to foreign markets, or you have a ton of supply with a little bit of demand from domestic consumers. And one of the challenges is that if anybody's taken economics and just the basics, if you have a ton of something and you don't have a lot of people who want to buy it, the price goes way down. And you could actually see a lot of American farmers struggle with that. If the price of dairy drops precipitously, we would all be very happy going to the grocery store and paying, 60 cents for a gallon of milk. And certainly eggs, right, have been in the news as a hot topic. We would love to see all of those prices drop. But we also don't want to put American farm producers out of business, right? It would be difficult for some, especially smaller scale, traditional, family owned dairy farms. There aren't a ton left. They would face immense pressure to operate with dramatic price drops. The other thing, and I saw it mentioned in the chat from Eric, is that the reciprocal tariffs and retaliatory tariffs also hurt farmers, right? If China suddenly says we're going to get soybeans from somewhere else, right? Then same kind of thing. American farmers are left with a lot of soybeans and not as many places to sell them. Prices go down. American farmers get hurt. Farmers are operating on a lot of leverage, unless they're a large monoscale farming, right, from a huge corporation. So you could really, the agricultural impacts are going to be that small farmers or medium-sized operators who are trying to still stay afloat are going to be hit the hardest. And we know last time the administration spent a huge amount of money to prop up the negative impacts on agriculture. And Eric, you mentioned West Virginia coal. I made the point that West Virginia is somewhat more insulated on the import side, as it doesn't import nearly as much from Canada and Mexico. But you're exactly right. China's imports of coal are going to be a thing that it has talked about targeting on the retaliatory tariffs. And so we didn't estimate those directly because, like I said, I don't want to make stuff up or try to scare folks and say, oh, if China slaps this crazy tariff on coal, it's going to wreck the whole thing. But we do know that China imports is a large off-taker of West Virginia coal, and that some of the early discussions about retaliatory tariffs have actually centered on coal. One reason for that, you could speculate, is that China will enact retaliatory tariffs on industries that could exert, or regions of the US that could exert political pressure on President Trump, right? So think about states that President Trump won. Pennsylvania was perhaps the biggest battleground state last time. We know the coal industry, West Virginia, but also strong in roots in historical context and politically in Pennsylvania over the last century. And steelmaking, right, or blast furnaces that rely on coal. So if you are an industry that is in one of our states, you may be a little more worried that a foreign country will attempt to leverage our industries in our states to exert, pressure on the administration. So certainly coal exports are a big thing to watch in West Virginia, and I would imagine will be part of a suite of retaliatory tariffs.
Thanks for the question, Eric.
But I'll also go back and real quick on the environmental side of that, right? Is if we don't export, if we can't export as much coal to China, then you start to wonder, well, where are we going to find demand for that coal, right? And if the government says, well, geez, we don't want coal mines to go out of business, so we're going to go ahead and buy the coal, or we're going to mandate, keep these coal plants online longer to feed it, right? And we start trying to prop up an industry with domestic consumption, right? Which could delay the energy transition even longer, or keep some plants running even though, their capacity factor is quite low and they don't really need to run. They could get subsidized, right? The coal could get subsidized to be burnt here in the United States because we can't sell it to China anymore. So there's a lot of what ifs and dominoes, but certainly that'll be a component of the story I'll be watching over the next several months. Any other thoughts or questions? Okay, well, I'll turn it back over to you, Ben, but thank you all for joining. And my email address is on the Orvie website, and always happy to take follow-up work. So I will follow up questions or any concerns you have, and thank you all for joining.
Nick, we've got one more question in the chat about let's see, coal export terminals. I'm sorry, in the Q&A box.
Yeah, I have not seen definitively, because I think that the retaliatory tariffs have not fully, the Chinese have not unveiled fully the suite of retaliatory tariffs, right? I think there's been some saber rattling. And I think that goes back to the uncertainty around a lot of these, right? Is countries are kind of waiting. We've seen stories about, well, Canada's not going to, they're going to tariff electricity coming into Michigan and New York and Minnesota, and China might tariff coal exports from West Virginia, or China may tariff soybeans or reduce soybean imports from the United States. Like, all of these pieces are swirling, but I think the uncertainty of the US policy has led other countries to kind of wait and see what we are actually going to do, right? So I think that kind of, no one wants to cast the first stone in a trade war. So if the trade war kind of begins and these retaliatory and reciprocal tariffs start kind of dominoing over different industries, it would be because the United States proceeds and goes ahead and implements the tariffs in full.
Well, thank you, Nick, and thank you, Daryl, for the question. And again, please do check out the report on our website. If other questions occur to you or comments, do feel free to reach out to us. Our contact information is listed in the About section of Orvia's website. Thanks, Nick, for the presentation and the research, and thank you all for joining us today. And we hope you have a good afternoon. Take care.